Hey everyone, and welcome. We're really happy you're joining us today. We're going to be talking about something that, well, it touches pretty much every single relationship we've ever had, attachment styles. And look, this deep dive isn't really about judging those patterns. It's more about understanding them. So stick with us. We're going to try and unpack what attachment really means and, how it shows up in everyday life.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that can feel really personal, sometimes a bit raw, actually, because it speaks to our earliest, most fundamental experiences of connection and safety.
Mm.
So as we go through the sources, we'll look at the core ideas, the research, but also listen for those personal stories, the ones that show what this stuff actually feels like to live through. Our mission really is to explore where these patterns come from, see how they show up, often in surprising ways in our adult lives,
Yeah.
and crucially to recognize that even though they're deep-rooted, they're not necessarily like fixed, not destiny.
Okay, so let's dive in then. We often hear about John Bowlby, right? Talking about that lasting psychological connectedness. For listeners who know the basics, how should we maybe think about that today?
Well, maybe think of it less as just a definition, and more like a biological drive. We seem to be wired for it right from the start. It's this fundamental need for closeness that helps us feel safe, especially as babies when we're totally dependent. Things like cooing, smiling, even crying, they're not random, they're signals designed to pull a caregiver close.
Right, so it's fundamentally about safety, and the caregiver's reaction, that's huge.
It's everything. The quality of that first interaction, the sources use this lovely phrase, the maternal-infant dance.
A dance, ain't it?
Yeah, it's this back and forth, a reciprocal loop. When a caregiver is available, like physically there, emotionally tuned in, and they respond, cuddling, looking, mirroring back affection, the baby responds to, snuggling, babbling, smiling. It creates this mutual pleasure, this satisfaction, and really cements that bond.
That idea of a dance really highlights the dynamic part of it. It's not just one way.
Not at all. And the caregiver's sensitivity, their
Yeah.
responsiveness, that's the key ingredient for security. Being able to, notice the baby's signals, figure out what they mean, and respond pretty quickly and appropriately. That consistency is what builds trust, a sense of safety. And these specific selective attachments, they start forming really early, like from birth. And it's not just one person either. We form lots of attachments through childhood, even into adolescence.
Mm. And it's amazing how strong that drive is, isn't it? Because even when things are tough, like with caregivers who aren't always safe or responsive, the attachment still forms somehow.
It does. The sources point out that even in situations of maltreatment, attachments happen. They have to for survival. But they're much more likely to be disorganized. The child needs the caregiver for comfort, but that same person might be scary or unpredictable. It's a really difficult, confusing situation.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely helps explain why these patterns can be so sticky later on. So, how did researchers start actually categorizing these different ways kids connect? That's where Mary Ainsworth comes in, isn't it? The strange situation.
Exactly. Ainsworth developed this standardized procedure, the strange situation. Basically, you bring a child and their caregiver into a room they don't know. There's a stranger involved. And you observe how the child reacts to a couple of short separations from the caregiver. And then, this is key, the reunions.
Okay, so it's like a mini stress test.
Kind of, yeah. The stressors are pretty mild. New place, new person, mom or dad leaves for a minute. But how the child acts when the caregiver comes back, that tells you a lot about the attachment relationship.
Right, the reunion behavior. And this led to identifying those main styles we hear about.
That's right. And while we often hear percentages, maybe it's more helpful to think about the core dynamic of each one. So the most common one they found was secure attachment. Here, the baby might get upset when the parent leaves, sure, but when they return, they actively seek comfort, they get soothed pretty easily, and then importantly, they go back to playing and exploring. They trust that secure base.
So they show their need, trust it'll be met, and feel safe enough to go back to, being a kid.
Exactly. Then you've got insecure avoidant. Now, these infants might look like they aren't bothered when the parent leaves, and when they return, they might ignore them or look away. But, and this is fascinating, the sources highlight this even though they seem cool on the outside, their internal stress levels, measured physiologically, they're high.
Wow. So they've learned not to show it.
Pretty much. They've learned that showing distress or seeking closeness maybe doesn't work or isn't welcomed, so they adapt by kind of shutting down that outward need, minimizing it.
That difference between the inside and outside, that must be so confusing for people interacting with them later, too. What about the next one, the anxious pattern?
Right, that's insecure ambivalent. or sometimes called anxious preoccupied. These babies get really distressed by the separation. But when the caregiver comes back, they're torn. They want closeness, they seek it, but they also resist it, maybe pushing away, hitting, would be really hard to console.
Wanting contact, but fighting it at the same time.
Yeah. It often stems from caregiving that's inconsistent. Like, sometimes needs are met, sometimes they aren't. So the child is left feeling really uncertain, maybe even angry about that unpredictability. Can they rely on this person or not?
Gosh, that sounds exhausting. For the child, I mean. Wanting closeness, but also being mad about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then there's the disorganized pattern. This one's often linked to more frightening or neglectful caregiving situations. It's maybe the most complex. These infants show really contradictory behaviors when the caregiver returns. Like, they might approach, but then suddenly freeze or pull back or show fear. Their movements can seem confused, apprehensive. They really struggle to regulate their emotions.
Why is that?
Because the person who is supposed to be their source of comfort is also sometimes the source of their fear. It's an impossible situation. The sources mentioned this creates profound anxiety and can really impact brain development.
It just hammers home that these aren't choices, are they? They're deep adaptations to what a child experienced. And Bowlby talked about how these experiences build an internal working model. What's that about?
Yes, that's a core concept. The internal working model.
Yeah.
Think of it like the first relationship software installed in our brains. It's a mental map, basically, built from those early interactions. A map of how relationships work, how available other people are likely to be, and, really importantly, how worthy or lovable we feel we are.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about what we expect from others, but also how we see ourselves in the context of connection.
Exactly right. And this model, this blueprint, it doesn't just stay in childhood. It guides our expectations, our feelings, our behaviors in future relationships all through life. That's why secure attachment is so beneficial, even beyond infancy.
Right.
Kids with that secure base, they develop trust. They feel safe exploring. Research suggests they tend to have better self-esteem, more empathy. They handle stress better. It just sets a really healthy foundation.
Yeah, a foundation of safety and self-worth. That makes navigating the world and relationships later on presumably much easier. And these patterns definitely don't just vanish after childhood, right? Hazan and Shaver applied this whole idea to adult romance.
They did, yeah. It was groundbreaking work showing how these same fundamental patterns play out in our adult partnerships. The behaviors look different, obviously, but the underlying dynamics, very similar. So we talk about adult styles: secure, anxious, preoccupied, dismissive, avoidant, and fearful avoidant, which is kind of the adult version of disorganized.
And this internal blueprint, it affects how we handle intimacy, conflict, how worthy we feel, basically everything in a relationship. How do these actually, look in adult relationships?
Okay, so secure adults, generally they find it easier to build stable, happy relationships. They're usually comfortable with closeness, but also okay with independence. Trust is there, healthy interdependence. They tend to communicate their needs pretty openly, handle disagreements constructively, generally report higher satisfaction.
Right. Sounds like the gold standard, maybe.
In many ways, yes. Then you have anxious, preoccupied adults. They often carry a lot of anxiety about the relationship, a deep fear of abandonment. This can lead to craving intense closeness, maybe needing constant reassurance, which can sometimes feel overwhelming to a partner. They might struggle to voice needs calmly, perhaps amplifying emotions to get attention, kind of like the ambivalent infants did. One source mentioned that specifically. This pattern often traces back to that inconsistent caregiving, leaving this lingering uncertainty and fear.
That's that painful paradox, isn't it? The fear of being left drives behaviors that can sometimes push people away.
It really can be. Then there's the dismissive avoidance style in adults. These individuals tend to value independence very highly, sometimes to the point of keeping emotional distance. They might be uncomfortable with vulnerability their own or their partner's, can seem aloof, maybe detached. Often this comes from early experiences where emotional needs weren't met or were dismissed. So they learn to rely on themselves and suppress those needs.
Yeah, we saw that echo in one of the user stories, didn't we? The avoidant person feeling misunderstood, struggling to explain what's going on inside, wondering if they push people away because they fear being needed, maybe due to being parentified as a kid.
Exactly. That story really captures the internal experience. It's not always about not caring. It's often a deep discomfort with vulnerability, with depending on someone because maybe that wasn't safe or reliable early on.
Makes sense. And the last one? Fearful avoidant.
Right, also called disorganized in adulthood. This was often linked to those more challenging, maybe traumatic, early experiences. These adults often struggle to find a consistent way of relating. They might desperately want connection, but be terrified of intimacy or getting hurt. So their behavior can swing wildly, maybe clingy and anxious one moment, then suddenly withdrawn or even hostile the next. They find it really hard to feel safe and calm in relationships. The sources connect this style with deep feelings of shame, anxiety, depression, a core belief of being somehow unlovable or flawed.
Wow. Hearing these laid out, especially with those personal stories woven in, it really drives home that these are coping mechanisms, aren't they? Understandable responses, not character defects. Builds empathy.
It really should. We read that other story too about the anxious person with an avoidant partner trying so hard to make it work, trying to give space, but feeling like a burden, feeling undesired. And that painful realization that the effort wasn't mutual, that the dynamic just wasn't sustainable, grieving that lack of appreciation.
And the insight that followed, that it can't just be on one person to do all the changing, all the maintaining, that really hit home.
Yeah. And some of those Reddit comments, people sharing deep grief over feeling like they'd lost years to fearful avoidance, missing out on life experiences, feeling like a failure because connection was so hard. But then, importantly,
Yeah.
others jumped in, offering hope, saying, hey, I've been there and it can get better, reinforcing that it's never truly too late to work on this stuff.
Okay, so that's the million-dollar question then, isn't it? Can these styles actually change? Are we stuck?
And the answer from the sources is a pretty resounding no, we are not necessarily stuck. Change is absolutely possible. These styles aren't rigid boxes, it's more like a spectrum. And our style can even shift a bit depending on who we're with.
So even if you didn't have that secure start, you can still get there. Become secure as an adult.
Yes. That's the whole idea of earned secure attachment. It means someone who started out with insecure patterns has, through conscious effort, maybe therapy, maybe supportive relationships, developed the capacity to function securely as an adult.
Okay. How does someone actually do that? What does that journey look like?
Well, it usually starts with self-awareness, really getting honest about your patterns, your triggers, how you react when you feel vulnerable or scared in relationships. Self-compassion is huge. Understanding why these patterns developed as adaptations, not flaws. And support is often key. That could be therapy, which is incredibly helpful for this work, or even just really safe, trusting relationships where you can practice differently.
Just learning about attachment theory itself feels like it could be a big first step, right? Giving it a name.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It provides a framework, a language to understand things that might have felt confusing or chaotic before. The sources talk about working on self-love, setting boundaries, which can be hard, practicing vulnerability in small, safe steps, and reflecting on your reactions without beating yourself up about them.
It sounds like work, maybe slow work.
It often is. One source used the image of a cargo ship turning. It's not instant, but it's a journey. And each step forward, even small ones, can bring real shifts, real joy. And importantly, earned security isn't just about finding the right partner to fix you. It's often about healing those core wounds inside yourself, building that secure base internally.
I remember reading a great analogy someone used, like learning a new language. You might still have your native attachment style, but you can become fluent in security. You can learn to speak it.
That's a fantastic way to put it. You build new skills, new ways of being in connection. The old patterns might still pop up sometimes, especially under stress, but you have more choices now, more capacity for healthy intimacy. It takes effort, definitely, and often support. But that possibility for growth, for healing, for building better relationships, it's really, really there.
So thinking about all this and connecting back to you listening, what really stands out?
Maybe you heard echoes of yourself in some of these descriptions, or perhaps in people you know, relationships you've been in. And just remembering, this understanding isn't about sticking labels on people or judging yourself or anyone else. It's truly about gaining insight. Insight for yourself, for navigating your connections, maybe for your own healing path.
And that insight, that awareness, it's powerful, isn't it?
It really is. It can help you approach relationships with maybe a bit more understanding, more compassion, and maybe a clearer sense of how to build the kinds of secure, fulfilling bonds you really want.
So here's a final thought to chew on. Given how deep these attachment roots go, right back to our first experiences, and how much they shape what we expect from others, what does it really mean to trust? Not just trusting other people, but trusting the possibility of change within ourselves. All right, that's about the wrap for today. We really hope this deep dive gave you something to think about, maybe even something to feel about, too. If it did, and you want more conversations like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Keep up with us. We've got more coming your way on connection, healing, and, real-life recovery stuff.
Yeah, and if you know someone who might connect with us, maybe someone exploring this stuff too, feel free to share it. We're all about building a community here, growing together.
Definitely. Until next time, take good care of yourself, stay connected in the ways that feel good, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.